The case of Lynette Hooker is no longer a missing persons file. It is now a suspected murder investigation. Brian Hooker, her husband, has quietly retained a new attorney with a former Department of Justice background, replacing the Michigan counsel he engaged weeks earlier. The Coast Guard cutter Margaret Norville is scheduled to depart Tuesday morning, with dive teams expected in Bahamian waters by Tuesday evening. Something shifted in the federal posture of this case, and the lawyer change suggests Brian Hooker already knows what it is. The version of this story most people have heard? It is missing the part that actually matters. If you want every verified development in this case as it breaks, subscribe, because this investigation is still moving. Here is what is documented. Lynette Hooker disappeared from the sailing vessel Soulmate, a U.S.-flagged boat registered in Florida, anchored in the Sea of Abico in the Bahamas. Her husband, Brian Hooker, claims he and Lynette were thrown from the dinghy, that the dinghy drifted unpowered for 8 to 9 hours, and that he eventually washed ashore at Marsh Harbor at 3:35 a.m. on April 5th, Easter morning. Lynette, by his account, was never seen again. The agency leading this investigation is not the FBI. It is the Coast Guard Investigative Service, CGIS. That distinction is the entire architectural backbone of what is about to happen. Because where the case sits jurisdictionally determines what evidence federal authorities can compel, what they can seize, and what they can ultimately charge. Soulmate has been seized. It is being towed to dry dock. The Royal Bahamian Police Force held the dinghy. And the Margaret Norville, a 154-foot fast response cutter, is now inbound with a dive team, a rigid inflatable boat, an ROV, and a canine cadaver dog named Maggie, on loan from the Broward County Sheriff's Office. But the central question has not changed. If Brian Hooker's account of that night is accurate, none of this equipment should be necessary. So why is it necessary? Start with the lawyer. Brian Hooker recently replaced his Michigan-based counsel with an attorney whose background sits inside the Federal Department of Justice. That is not a lateral move. That is a defendant preparing for a federal proceeding. And federal jurisdiction over a homicide on the open water exists for one specific reason. Under U.S. maritime statute, when a person is killed aboard a U.S.-flagged vessel, the United States Coast Guard has direct investigative authority. Soulmate is a U.S.-flagged vessel. The dinghy that allegedly threw both Hookers overboard belonged to that vessel. A second statutory pathway also applies. When a U.S. citizen dies on foreign land, federal authority can attach. Either way, the door to federal charges is already open. Now layer the next contradiction. Brian Hooker's stated account requires that the dinghy drifted helplessly all night without propulsion. But the GPS data from that night, preserved on the dinghy's electronics, does not show drift. It shows movement. Specific, directed movement. The kind of movement that is physically impossible without a working motor. A drifting hull obeys wind and current. It ends up on a rocky shore or a beach. It does not maneuver. It does not change heading. It does not visit locations. The GPS log shows the dinghy doing things that an unpowered dinghy cannot do, which means one of two things is true. Either the propulsion was working, and Brian Hooker's account of how Lynette was lost is incorrect, or the GPS device itself is registering data that contradicts the chain of custody of that evening. Investigators are reportedly focused on the first interpretation. There is a reason for that focus, and it has nothing to do with the boat. When Soulmate was seized and searched, investigators cataloged the contents of the vessel and the dinghy. Most items were accounted for. Personal effects, dive gear, Lynette's belongings. One item was missing. Lynette Hooker owned a pink weight belt, a dive belt designed to carry lead weights for descent. It was hers. It was kept aboard. To investigators' knowledge at this point, it has not been recovered. A missing weight belt, in the context of a missing person last seen aboard a boat, raises a single immediate operational question. And the Coast Guard's decision to deploy a dive team, not a recovery team, a dive team, suggests they have already asked it. That question is whether the absence of the weight belt explains why standard surface search patterns have produced nothing in 7 weeks. The dark tablet-like device in Brian Hooker's left hand at 3:35 a.m. Does its absence by the time rescuers arrived point to something he discarded or something he was never supposed to be carrying? If the next filing changes what we covered today, stay with this channel for it. Return to Brian Hooker's history. This is documented record, not speculation. Brian Hooker was previously tried for the alleged choking of his 12-year-old daughter. The matter went to a jury. The jury acquitted him. The defense theory at trial reportedly involved implanted memories, a defense more commonly raised with much younger children, and one the jury ultimately accepted. The child, per the record, has had no contact with Brian Hooker since. Allegations of similar conduct toward Lynette Hooker were documented across multiple sources before her disappearance. Lynette reportedly told her mother, her friends, and battered women's resources that Brian had choked her to the point of unconsciousness. She allegedly disclosed that he had said to her on one occasion that he should have finished the job. Photographs of bruising on her back were reportedly shown to a friend, with Lynette describing the injury as occurring against the back of the sailboat during a choking incident. She left Brian multiple times. She returned each time. Her mother reportedly begged her not to go back. On March 11th, roughly 2 weeks before her disappearance, Lynette Hooker purchased a ticket. She did not use it. Now the AT&T record. Brian Hooker was reportedly terminated by AT&T after multiple incidents involving the company-issued GPS device on his work van. According to the documentation, he was tampering with the GPS to misrepresent his location. The company attempted to terminate him on prior occasions. The third attempt was the one that succeeded, because by then the tampering was provable. A documented pattern of location concealment. In a case now centered on disputed GPS data from a dinghy. That is the procedural backdrop the new federal attorney is reportedly preparing to litigate. But none of it explains what surveillance video allegedly captured at the boatyard that morning. Brian Hooker arrived on foot at the boatyard south of Marsh Harbor at approximately 3:35 a.m. on April 5th, Easter morning. He had, by his account, just survived 8 to 9 hours adrift in the Sea of Abico, watching his wife disappear into open water. The surveillance video reportedly does not show a man in distress. It shows a man walking up calmly to the chain-link perimeter of the boatyard, wearing a blue patterned shirt, dark shorts, and blue slides, a cowboy-styled hat, a yellow dry bag. He calls out for help, but quietly, without urgency, without panic, without any mention of his missing wife. He checks his watch, then he checks it again, then again. He wanders the property, looking behind objects. He moves into shadow, then back into light, apparently unaware that lights from nearby buildings are catching him. And in his left hand, he is reportedly holding something, a small, dark, tablet-like object. When Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue arrived to recover him a short time later, 4 rescuers on a boat with police, the object was no longer in his hand. What it was, and where it went between 3:35 a.m. and the moment rescuers arrived, that window is now part of what the Margaret Norville is being sent to investigate. So is the geography. There are 2 operational theories about where Lynette Hooker's remains could be located. The first involves water disposal, somewhere within range of an 8-foot dinghy powered by a battery-limited electric motor. That radius rules out the open Atlantic. It does not rule out areas inside the Sea of Abico, including the eastern shore of Marsh Harbor, south of where Brian Hooker allegedly washed ashore, an area that, notably, Maggie has not yet searched. The second involves Tulu Cut. Inside the Tulu Cut area sits a stretch of water reportedly 40 feet deep, protected enough to enter at night, deep enough to conceal an object weighted with, for example, a pink dive belt. That is the operational geometry the Coast Guard cutter, the dive team, the ROV, and the cadaver canine are arriving to address. Maggie will reportedly also search the dinghy itself, which had not been canine searched previously because it was held by Bahamian authorities. 7 weeks of Bahamian rainfall on an impounded vessel is a significant variable. Decomposition oils, which Maggie's handler has confirmed she can detect even through 30 feet of water under optimal conditions, may have been degraded by weather exposure on the dinghy. The investigative architecture echoes other cases in the federal maritime and cadaver canine space. The procedural sealing and multi-jurisdictional coordination pattern in the Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell prosecutions in Idaho followed a similar arc: federal posture, cadaver canine deployment, and a long evidentiary recovery window. And the Sarm Heslop disappearance from the U.S.-flagged catamaran Siren Song in the U.S. Virgin Islands raised many of the same federal maritime jurisdictional questions now governing the Hooker investigation. Questions about when CGIS or federal authority attaches to a death aboard a U.S.-flagged vessel in foreign waters. The Hooker case is not anomalous. It is, procedurally, the moment when maritime law stops being theoretical and becomes a charging document. When a U.S.-flagged vessel becomes a federal crime scene, the standard of evidence is not what a state grand jury demands. It is what a federal indictment requires. That is why the new attorney matters. That is why Tuesday matters. And that is why the pink weight belt, the missing object from Brian Hooker's left hand, and the GPS log that contradicts his account are not three separate questions. They are one. If this case matters to you, the next development is one you won't want to miss. Whether Maggie's water-based cadaver alert capability still functions 7 weeks after the disappearance, and whether the dinghy's exposure to Bahamian rainfall has erased the scent profile investigators need, remains a question the Coast Guard Investigative Service has not publicly answered.